There is a particular kind of tension that arrives quietly, long after the noise of the world has faded, when you realize that the people around you are not always what you imagine them to be. It is subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a shadow brushing across the floor at dusk. You sense it not in shouts, not in confrontation, but in the small, persistent patterns of behavior that accumulate over time, the choices others make, the boundaries they ignore, the little ways they test patience without knowing it. And in that silence, you begin to understand something you could not see before, that there is one personality trait you no longer tolerate. Not because it threatens you directly, but because it quietly erodes the integrity of every interaction it touches. I remember an imagined period where I tried to accommodate everything, every contradiction, every lapse of judgment, every subtle dismissal, because I believed in giving space, in understanding the nuance of people's intentions. I thought patience was a kind of strength. I thought tolerance was proof of compassion. But slowly, through countless imagined interactions, I realized that there is a threshold. And the moment you cross it, the patience that once felt generous begins to feel corrosive. It is not anger that teaches this lesson. It is the quiet understanding that some traits are fundamentally incompatible with the respect and clarity required to build trust, influence, and authentic connection. There were nights when I sat alone in imagined rooms, watching patterns emerge that had previously gone unnoticed. Someone would repeat the same evasive tactic over and over, or shift responsibility just enough to muddy clarity, or dismiss insight with a thin veneer of agreement while continuing behaviors that undermined it. At first, you might forgive these things, rationalize them as misunderstandings, or convince yourself that context matters. But over time, a deep awareness emerges. You recognize the weight of tolerating what cannot be changed, and how it silently shapes your own behavior, lowering standards, eroding patience, and diluting the quiet confidence that once guided every decision. I began noticing it not as a dramatic moment, but as a creeping realization. A pause in conversation that feels heavier than usual. A choice offered that lacks integrity, even though the words sound sincere. A pattern repeated, despite warnings that had been softly given. The trait itself, call it evasiveness, entitlement, or habitual disregard, becomes like a shadow behind every interaction, and you start measuring the cost of continued tolerance. How much energy, how much clarity, how much emotional patience are you willing to give away before it compromises the very foundation of presence? There is a subtle paradox here. Strong men, especially those who value emotional honesty and depth, often endure behaviors far longer than they should because endurance has been celebrated as a virtue. We are told to be patient, to give others the benefit of doubt, to maintain composure even in the face of repeated inconsistency. And yet, the strength that makes endurance admirable is not endless. There is a line between patience and compromise, and eventually you find it. You recognize that tolerating the wrong traits is not generosity, is depletion. It steals quiet power, and it diminishes the ability to lead with presence. I remember a quiet evening, imagining a conversation where I finally chose not to justify, explain, or negotiate beyond what felt aligned with truth. In that imagined exchange, there was a calm revelation. Tolerance has limits. Not limits born of anger or pride, but limits born of respect for oneself and the value of intentional interaction. There is something quietly liberating about recognizing that it is acceptable, even necessary, to stop accommodating behaviors that compromise clarity, honesty, and mutual growth. And yet, the recognition of this one trait is not accompanied by dramatic confrontation. There are no explosive moments, no declarations of judgment. Instead, there is a quiet internal realignment. You adjust the boundaries of presence and influence, ensuring that every choice to engage is intentional. You begin to listen differently, speak differently, and measure attention not by default, but by discernment. The trait you no longer tolerate ceases to dominate interactions not through force, but through the careful application of absence, reflection, and selective engagement. Over time, this quiet discernment begins to reshape relationships entirely. You notice which connections thrive when integrity is honored and which falter under habitual disregard. You recognize that influence and respect are not extracted through loud demands, but through consistent alignment with values that matter most. It is not about proving superiority or asserting control, it is about protecting presence and emotional clarity. And in that protection, the voice that once tried to accommodate every flaw begins to speak only when alignment and authenticity intersect. The more I imagined this shift, the more I understood a paradox of human behavior. People often mistake patience for weakness or tolerance for acceptance. But those who practice quiet strength learn the difference between observation and indulgence. They see the patterns, acknowledge them, and consciously decide which to engage and which to release. And in that decision lies power, not the performative kind, but the steady, grounded, emotionally mature kind that shapes presence without forcing attention. There is a long, imagined night where I reflected on every interaction that had tested patience without adding value. I realized that this one trait, small yet persistent, had quietly determined the quality of engagement, the flow of energy, and the measure of trust. Tolerance for it had been a silent tax, and recognizing its boundaries became an act of self-preservation, not judgment. I understood that by no longer tolerating it, I was not rejecting people. I was preserving the conditions necessary for clarity, integrity, and meaningful connection. And yet, this discovery is not about rigid rules. It is about discerning energy, evaluating patterns, and holding space for what matters. You begin to notice subtleties. The difference between a momentary lapse and habitual disregard, between accountability and deflection, between empathy and evasion. Each recognition becomes a small step toward mastery over attention, influence, and presence. The quiet realization that some traits simply do not deserve tolerance allows the strongest parts of identity to thrive. Unencumbered by patterns that previously drained energy and focus, there is a calm, reflective question that arises in this awareness. If one personality trait can quietly corrode trust, patience, and presence, what does it teach about the boundaries you must maintain for yourself? It is not a question of punishment, but of stewardship over time, over relationships, and over the emotional space that allows strength to endure. Observing without tolerating becomes a discipline, one that redefines how engagement, respect, and influence are allocated. By the end of those imagined reflections, I saw clearly that this trait, the one I stopped tolerating, was less about others and more about how I chose to invest energy. The realization was liberating. Strength matures not by accommodating every flaw, but by discerning which patterns deserve engagement and which demand quiet absence. And in that discernment, quiet confidence is born. Not from confrontation or assertion, but from clarity, alignment, and a refusal to compromise presence for the sake of others' inconsistency. In that calm understanding, I felt a quiet resolution. The strongest men do not tolerate patterns that erode their values, even subtly. They allow presence to guide choice, and they cultivate engagement only where alignment exists. And it is in this quiet practice, often invisible to the outside world, that power, integrity, and emotional maturity converge. It is not about proving anything to anyone. It is about maintaining the conditions in which strength, clarity, and meaningful presence can flourish naturally. There is a moment, often quiet and unassuming, when you begin to notice the subtle ways certain behaviors drain your presence. It is not loud or confrontational. It does not arrive with fanfare. Instead, it creeps in through repeated patterns, small inconsistencies, evasive gestures, or moments of entitlement that pierce the calm you have cultivated over years. And in that observation, you feel a growing clarity, a recognition that one personality trait, seemingly harmless at first, has quietly been testing the limits of your patience. It is the kind of awareness that makes you pause mid-conversation, reflecting on how much energy you expend trying to accommodate what does not align with honesty, integrity, or mutual respect. I remember an imagined period when I attempted to tolerate everything, believing that generosity of spirit meant overlooking repeated lapses. I told myself that understanding required patience, that empathy required giving second chances, that leadership required enduring the flaws of others. Yet over time, a subtle shift occurred. I noticed that tolerance, when extended without discretion, begins to weigh heavily. It accumulates quietly, layer upon layer, until the very strength that allowed patience starts to feel fragmented, diffused. And in that quiet accumulation, you realize that endurance is not limitless. And that sometimes the most courageous act is the decision to no longer accommodate what undermines trust or clarity. There were imagined nights where I reflected on exchanges that left me feeling drained, despite no visible confrontation taking place. Someone would speak in ways that avoided accountability, twist intentions, or redirect responsibility. At first, I rationalized it, attributing it to misunderstanding, context, or temporary lapse. But repetition creates clarity. Over countless imagined interactions, a pattern became unmistakable. The trait that had quietly chipped away at engagement revealed itself: habitual evasion, disregard for consistency, or subtle attempts to manipulate perception. And once recognized, the choice to no longer tolerate it was less about rejection and more about preserving the integrity of every subsequent engagement. I began to notice an internal tension, one that exists between empathy and self-preservation. Strong men, particularly those who value emotional honesty, often endure behaviors far longer than they should. We are taught that patience is a virtue, that endurance signifies strength. Yet enduring the wrong traits silently corrodes presence. It diminishes the clarity with which we observe, the authenticity with which we speak, and the confidence with which we engage. In this tension, a critical question emerges: when does tolerance become compromise? And at what point does patience transform into depletion? One imagined evening, I visualized a scenario where I finally chose not to explain, justify, or negotiate beyond what felt aligned with truth. In that imagined space, a quiet realization settled: boundaries are not weakness. Choosing not to tolerate certain behaviors is not a judgment, but an assertion of self-respect and intentional presence. The strength that comes from this recognition is subtle, yet profound. It does not announce itself through confrontation. It exists in the quiet confidence that your engagement will now be guided by alignment and integrity, rather than obligation or fear of conflict. Yet this understanding does not arrive instantly. There are periods of reflection when you notice the patterns without immediately responding. You observe the evasions, the manipulations, the repeated disregard, and you ask yourself quietly, how much energy am I willing to invest before my presence is compromised? How many interactions can I sustain without eroding my own standards? These questions do not seek immediate answers. They linger like shadows, shaping perception and guiding choices with patient subtlety. As I imagined more of these evenings, I noticed another dimension: the realization that influence is not about reacting to every inconsistency. True influence emerges when engagement is intentional, selective, and measured. When you stop tolerating behaviors that erode clarity, your attention becomes more deliberate, your presence more magnetic, and your voice, though quieter, more authoritative. There's a paradox in this: speaking less, tolerating less, and observing more often creates greater impact than endless accommodation ever could. Over time, this approach reshaped imagined relationships. Connections that thrived were those built on integrity, honesty, and mutual respect. Those that relied on habitual disregard or evasion gradually faded, not through confrontation, but through conscious realignment of attention. Influence became less about control or assertion and more about stewardship, the careful allocation of energy, presence, and trust. And in that stewardship, the one personality trait that was no longer tolerated ceased to dominate interaction, quietly allowing clarity and authenticity to flourish. I began noticing subtle patterns within myself. I realized that patience, when applied indiscriminately, could dull intuition. Tolerance without discretion could blur judgment. And by no longer accommodating the trait that quietly undermined engagement, I discovered a form of strength that was not performative but enduring. It was the kind of strength that did not need to assert itself loudly. It simply existed in the consistent application of principles, the measured allocation of attention, and the deliberate choice to engage only where alignment existed. And yet, this discovery raised another reflective question: if one personality trait can quietly erode trust, How do we recognize the point where tolerance should end? It is not a question of punishment, nor is it about rigid rules. It is about discernment, about observing patterns, and about understanding the subtle ways that repeated behaviors shape energy, influence, and connection. Learning to observe without indulgence, to care without compromise, becomes a cornerstone of quiet strength. There were imagined nights when I replayed exchanges that once frustrated me. I noticed the difference between occasional mistakes and habitual disregard. Between moments of misunderstanding and patterns of evasion, each recognition became a lesson in the stewardship of presence, how to invest energy, how to set boundaries, how to allow engagement only where integrity is honored. And in that practice, quiet confidence grew. Not from confrontation or assertion, but from clarity, alignment, and discernment. Ultimately, the realization was simple, yet profound. The strongest men do not tolerate patterns that quietly erode presence. They preserve clarity, protect integrity, and allocate attention intentionally. They understand that power is not demonstrated through endurance of every flaw, but through the careful maintenance of conditions where strength, authenticity, and meaningful engagement can thrive. And in that quiet understanding, influence becomes subtle yet undeniable, like a gravitational pull felt rather than seen. By the end of those imagined reflections, I recognized that this one trait, the one I stopped tolerating, was less about others and more about how I chose to invest myself. The realization was liberating. Patience and tolerance are not infinite. Strength matures not by enduring every flaw, but by discerning which patterns deserve attention and which demand quiet absence. In that discernment, presence becomes refined, relationships become intentional, and quiet strength emerges not from avoidance, but from alignment with what truly matters. There's a certain clarity that emerges when you stop tolerating behaviors that quietly drain your energy. It is not immediate, and it is never dramatic. Instead, it arrives like illumination, revealing patterns that were once invisible beneath the surface of daily interaction. I remember imagined moments when conversations once seemed ordinary but now carried subtle tension. The evasions, the half-truths, the habitual deflections, they were all there, but previously unnoticed. And in noticing, I realized something. The one personality trait I could no longer tolerate was not simply an annoyance. It was a silent force that shaped the rhythm of every interaction, the weight of every decision, and the measure of my own patience. I reflected on why tolerance had persisted for so long. Perhaps it was fear, the quiet kind that whispers, if you draw the line, you risk conflict or loss or rejection. Perhaps it was hope, the kind that insists people will eventually change if given enough chances. Or perhaps it was pride, the belief that patience alone was proof of strength. Yet over time, repeated exposure revealed the truth. Endurance without discernment is not strength. It is subtle compromise. And in that compromise, the quiet erosion of clarity begins. I imagined evenings when I would sit alone, replaying conversations, noticing moments when my attention had been diverted by evasions or indirect speech. A question emerged, quiet but persistent. If I allow this to continue, what am I tolerating in myself? What am I sacrificing in the name of patience? These reflections did not arrive with condemnation, only with observation. And in that observation, I began to understand that the strongest form of presence requires more than tolerance. It requires discernment, the courage to differentiate between patterns worth enduring and patterns that quietly undermine engagement, honesty, and mutual respect. There was one imagined exchange that stayed with me. I had spent hours explaining a vision, providing context, answering questions, and offering clarification. The person listening nodded, smiled, and responded in ways that seemed courteous yet detached. Over time, I noticed the pattern repeated in multiple forms, subtle deflections, the absence of accountability, and an insistence on framing matters to suit personal comfort. It was in that repetition that the quiet lesson emerged. Some traits are not temporary lapses, and patience has limits. Strength lies not in continuing to accommodate them, but in choosing when to engage and when to step back. I began to notice an internal rhythm shifting. My attention became more selective. My presence became intentional. I stopped speaking to fill silence or to appease habitual disregard. Each interaction carried a subtle calibration, what was necessary to address, and what could be allowed to exist without personal compromise. And in that practice, I discovered something profound: restraint. When guided by discernment, does not diminish authority, it refines it. Influence does not require constant engagement. Sometimes, influence grows quietly through observation, integrity, and the careful preservation of energy. The more I reflected, the more I understood the paradox of tolerance and quiet strength. Tolerance had previously felt like generosity, an expansive form of patience. But unchecked, it became a slow erosion, a quiet surrender of boundaries and presence. And the decision to no longer tolerate the trait in question was not punitive, nor was it reactive. It was deliberate. It was an alignment of presence, energy, and values, a recalibration that allowed influence, authenticity, and clarity to flourish without interference. I imagine mornings when this realization manifested in subtle ways. Conversations became shorter, more focused. Listening became active rather than reactive. Engagement was no longer measured by volume or duration, but by authenticity and alignment. People who had previously elicited frustration now revealed themselves more clearly. Their patterns, once confusing or exhausting, were now illuminated, and the choice to interact or not was entirely intentional. Strength, I realized, is not about enduring everything. It is about discerning what deserves attention and what does not. Yet this discernment is not simple. It carries its own internal conflict. On one hand, there is empathy, the natural inclination to understand and forgive. On the other, there is self-preservation, the quiet insistence that presence and energy must be protected. These forces coexist uneasily, requiring constant reflection. I asked myself, how do you balance empathy with discernment? How do you care without compromising clarity? These questions do not have immediate answers. They linger in reflective silence, shaping the rhythms of thought and guiding decisions in subtle, almost invisible ways. Over time, I began noticing the emotional consequences of these decisions. By no longer tolerating the behaviors that undermined engagement, I experienced a kind of liberation. There was more space for meaningful interactions, more room for authenticity, and a clearer understanding of where influence truly resides. I realized that presence is most powerful when it is intentional, not reactive. Strength does not demand visibility. It demands alignment. And when alignment guides engagement, relationships shift subtly but profoundly. There is also a personal insight in observing how this trait, once tolerated, impacted my internal rhythm. Each repeated lapse or evasion had previously introduced small vibrations of tension, diverting focus and diluting energy. Once discernment replaced tolerance, those vibrations quieted. I noticed clarity returning, intuition sharpening, and the quiet authority of presence strengthening. Strength, I realized, is not measured in how much one endures, but in how consistently one aligns with what truly matters. And as these reflections deepened, I encountered another question: what patterns, repeated quietly over time, subtly erode presence without anyone noticing? This is not about external judgment, but about internal calibration. How often do we accommodate what should not be accommodated in the name of patience, empathy, or hope? And in examining that question, I recognize that discernment, knowing when to tolerate and when to disengage, is one of the most profound forms of quiet power a man can cultivate. In those imagined reflections, I began to understand that the one personality trait I stopped tolerating was less about the other person and more about protecting the integrity of my own presence. Strength is refined through alignment, not endurance. Influence grows through intentionality, not constant accommodation. And the subtle shift from tolerating to discerning quietly transforms not only interactions, but also identity. Presence, clarity, and authority emerge not from volume or performance, but from measured engagement, alignment, and the courage to act with intentional restraint. By the end of those imagined nights, I recognized that this understanding was deeply personal yet universal. Strong men often endure far longer than they should, believing patience is an ultimate virtue. But true strength, I realized, is discernment, knowing which patterns to accommodate, which to challenge, and which to simply step away from. And in that discernment, quiet authority emerges, a presence that does not demand attention, yet commands respect, fosters alignment, and protects the integrity of every interaction. There is a subtle evolution that begins once discernment replaces tolerance, one that feels less like confrontation and more like quiet clarity. It is not loud and it rarely draws attention. Instead, it manifests in the rhythm of thought, in the spaces between words, and in the deliberate cadence of presence. I remember imagined evenings when I sat reflecting on interactions from earlier days, noticing how the absence of toleration created room for intentional engagement. What had once been exhausted by distraction now moved with focus. And in that focus, I realized something profound. Strength is not demonstrated by how much one can endure, but by how wisely one chooses to engage. In earlier imagined years, I had equated strength with perseverance at any cost. To continue despite friction, to tolerate indefinitely, to maintain composure even as subtle energies eroded focus, these were the measures I had adopted. But time, reflection, and repeated observation taught me that not every battle merits effort. Not every personality, no matter how close or seemingly necessary, deserves the constant accommodation of one's energy. I began to see that endurance without discernment slowly diminishes presence, blurs priorities, and creates an invisible debt of fatigue. Strength, in its quietest form, chooses boundaries carefully. I recall imagined moments when this realization shaped interactions in ways that felt almost imperceptible. Conversations that might have once dragged on now felt concise, purposeful, and authentic. The subtle elimination of tolerated evasions, deflections, or distractions created space for listening rather than responding, observing rather than reacting. And in observing, I noticed the nuance of human behavior in ways that loud engagement had previously obscured. Strength, I realized, does not need volume to be felt. It is embedded in the rhythm of presence, in the consistency of engagement, and in the intentionality of attention. There was one imagined morning where I considered the personal cost of tolerating the trait I had finally stopped allowing. I saw how much energy had been quietly siphoned, how many hours of reflection had been diluted by accommodating behaviors that contributed little to truth or alignment. The insight was simple, yet profound. Energy devoted without discernment is not generosity, it is compromise. And compromise, repeated over time, erodes clarity, diminishes impact, and masks the subtle authority that quiet strength demands. By refusing to continue tolerating, I reclaim not only energy but presence itself. The internal tension in this evolution is persistent. On one hand, there is empathy, the desire to understand, forgive, and maintain connection. On the other, there is the need to protect the integrity of thought, the cadence of purpose, and the depth of engagement. These forces exist in delicate balance. I found myself asking quiet, reflective questions. How much accommodation is truly constructive? When does patience begin to compromise clarity? And at what point does strength require selective presence rather than indiscriminate endurance? These questions do not offer immediate resolution. They linger, forming a gentle, persistent rhythm beneath every decision. In imagined interactions, I began noticing the effect of this evolution on those around me. People who once elicited frustration through evasion now either adapted or revealed themselves clearly. The subtle power of non-tolerance reshaped expectations. Relationships no longer relied on verbal insistence or performative patience. Instead, they became spaces of alignment, where energy was preserved for authenticity, attention was guided by discernment, and engagement occurred on terms of mutual respect. Strength, I realized, is not about domination or assertion, it is about cultivating presence that communicates without force. I also observed a transformation in internal reflection. By refusing to accommodate the trait any longer, I discovered a kind of quiet liberation. Thoughts were less fragmented, attention was less scattered, and the internal dialogue became clearer. Patterns that once drained focus were now visible, analyzed, and addressed with intent. Strength, in this context, was not a demonstration of endurance, but a refinement of influence. The quiet authority of presence became more tangible than any previous expression of force or volume, yet this evolution is not without its subtle tensions. The line between discernment and detachment is delicate. One must remain vigilant, ensuring that non-tolerance does not slip into disengagement, and that protection of energy does not become avoidance. I ask myself reflective questions. Am I stepping back to preserve clarity or withdrawing to escape discomfort? Am I setting boundaries or simply avoiding responsibility? These questions remained unresolved in the moment, but sitting with them cultivated awareness, patience, and emotional maturity. Over time, I noticed another dimension of change. This quiet discernment reshaped not only interactions but also self-perception. The energy saved from no longer tolerating the trait could now be devoted to presence, reflection, and thoughtful action. The internal authority of alignment strengthened. Influence was no longer a function of persistence or volume, but of intentionality, observation, and consistency. Strength matured quietly, demonstrating its impact not through force, but through presence, patience, and subtle guidance. I imagined evenings when this quiet transformation became tangible. Sitting alone with reflection, I recognized how much of earlier frustration had stemmed not from external behavior, but from my own willingness to tolerate it. By choosing discernment over endurance, I reclaimed subtle authority and created space for authenticity to thrive. The quiet power of presence, calm, measured, aligned, emerged as something far more enduring than any previous assertion of influence or resilience. There is also a relational dimension. Quiet strength reshapes connection. By no longer tolerating the trait, interactions began to feel lighter, clearer, and more aligned with intention. Love, respect, and collaboration benefited from boundaries that were once absent. The energy previously spent navigating evasions or deflections was now available for presence, active listening, and genuine engagement. And in those moments, I observed an important truth. Influence is not derived from tolerating everything, but from preserving the integrity of attention and energy. As reflection deepened, another question emerged. How many people quietly compromise clarity by tolerating what should not be tolerated? And how many allow patience to dilute presence, believing endurance itself is strength? The answer is not binary. It is measured in the subtleties of daily interactions, the cumulative weight of repeated choices, and the quiet power that emerges when discernment replaces tolerance. This insight reshaped the understanding of influence, authority, and self-respect. By the end of those imagined reflections, I noticed that the quiet transformation was complete not in external displays but internally. Strength was now measured by presence, clarity, and alignment rather than volume, persistence, or accommodation. The authority of influence rested on intentional engagement, not continuous endurance. And the one personality trait I had stopped tolerating, once a source of subtle tension, had become a guide for cultivating quiet, sustainable power. There comes a final stage in this quiet transformation of strength, one that feels less like confrontation and more like steady understanding. It is the point where the urge to prove, to justify, or to insist finally softens into a consistent rhythm of presence. I imagine evenings where the world's noise fades, leaving only the subtle echo of what truly matters. In those moments, I notice that strength is no longer defined by how much one can tolerate, how loudly one can speak, or how visibly one can assert. It becomes fidelity to oneself, a steady alignment with internal truth. Even when external validation is absent. In earlier imagined years, I had equated influence with visibility. To be noticed, to be persuasive, to command attention, these seemed inseparable from being effective. I thought that authority required continuous demonstration, that respect was earned through persistence and loud engagement. But reflection and time taught me otherwise. True influence does not always arrive through force or volume. Sometimes it emerges quietly, through patience, consistency, and a presence that communicates meaning more clearly than words ever could. I recall an imagined evening when I observed those around me who carried themselves quietly. They spoke selectively, listened attentively, and engaged with deliberation rather than compulsion. Their subtlety drew attention, created clarity, and shaped outcomes without fanfare. In their quiet, I recognized an echo of my own evolution. The man who had once equated loudness with strength had not vanished, he had transformed. Strength had matured into something that no longer demanded validation, yet exerted influence naturally and effortlessly. This quietness reshapes relationships as well. Love, connection, and loyalty respond differently to subtlety than to spectacle. I imagined interactions where presence mattered more than explanation, where gestures carried more weight than words, and where consistency held more significance than intensity. Quiet strength does not create distance. It invites others in without pressure, without performance. Its authority is not imposed, but embodied. And in that embodiment, the strongest influence emerges not through coercion or insistence, but through the safety and stability one radiates. Even internal conflict begins to shift in this state. Questions that once demanded urgent answers about doubt, judgment, and self-worth become contemplative companions. They no longer require resolution, only observation. I noticed that when I allowed these questions to exist without immediate answers, they revealed layers of clarity I could not have accessed under pressure. The quiet rule I follow, the one born from years of reflection, is simple yet profound. Presence carries authority. Patience cultivates understanding, and enduring strength does not always assert itself. Sometimes it waits, observes, and allows clarity to form naturally. I imagined walking through memories of past conversations, decisions, and unspoken moments. I realized that what remains at the core of influence is rarely the magnitude of achievement, the visibility of success, or the assertiveness of action. What remains is emotional resonance, the subtle imprint left through calm presence, integrity, and intentional care. Quiet men do not become quiet because they lose power. They become quiet because their power evolves into something that no longer needs demonstration. It becomes invisible, yet undeniable. Reflection also brought compassion. I thought of the younger self who equated volume with being heard, intensity with strength, and persistence with value. I felt a quiet understanding for that version, recognizing that loudness was necessary at the time. Yet I also saw the inevitability of transformation. Strength matures when it learns to distinguish urgency from importance, action from reflection, visibility from presence. The evolution carries humility, not defeat, presence, not performance. It allows integrity to flourish without continuous validation from the outside. Quiet strength deepens emotional connection. I imagined relationships where mutual trust grows not from insistence, but from the reliability of presence, the repetition of thoughtful gestures, and patience for the natural unfolding of understanding. Vulnerability is safe within this space because it is met with steadiness rather than judgment. Patience and attentiveness coexist with independence and agency. Caring deeply does not require constant reassurance. And in observing these patterns, I realized that influence is strongest when it is unobtrusive, subtle, and authentic. Finally, I returned to a fundamental insight. The quiet man is not silent because he has nothing to say, but because he has learned that words carry their deepest meaning only when they serve understanding rather than ego. Silence is not emptiness, it is a vessel. Listening becomes more than habit. It becomes principle. And in that principle, strength matures into a form that is enduring, grounded, and humane. Ambition can coexist with presence, courage with patience, and love with independence. In this quiet state, questions remain, yet they no longer demand immediate answers. They exist to be observed, respected for their complexity, and allowed to shape perspective without destabilizing it. And I understand now that the ultimate evolution of strength is not in how loudly it can be expressed, but in how profoundly it can exist without assertion. The man who speaks less, listens more, and prioritizes presence over performance has finally learned the deepest truth. True power is measured not externally, but internally by alignment, by observation, and by the generosity of steady presence.